So the first time I saw this movie was in theaters, but this time around I caught it at home. So in this instance, I saw A Quiet Place in a different place. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my John Krasinski review series, where I'm going through each of the films directed by John Krasinski, leading up to my review of A Quiet Place Part 2. And today we're talking about his third film, 2018's A Quiet Place. Let me know in the comments before we begin what your thoughts on A Quiet Place were if you've seen it already, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about A Quiet Place. This stars Krasinski and Emily Blunt as two parents who do what it takes to keep their children safe in a world full of creatures hunting every sound they can hear. Not a sound can be heard from the family hiding in silence, but all it takes is one noise and everything can go wrong. So as I've done with some of my reviews of other older films, this will contain spoilers. I hadn't done that for the other two films in this series, as I don't think a lot of people saw them to begin with, and there really wasn't much to discuss in terms of spoilers. But here, I do want to get into a few things from later in the movie. So if you haven't seen A Quiet Place and wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. This originated from a story by Brian Woods and Scott Beck, who wrote the initial screenplay, with Krasinski himself doing rewrites, and all three are credited as screenwriters for this. This is also Krasinski's first major foray into horror, both as a director and as an actor. And it's worth noting that he didn't even grow up on horror movies himself, and doesn't seem to have been too immersed in the genre otherwise. He stated films like Don't Breathe and Get Out were influences on this, but he mainly cited them as part of research he was doing when crafting the film, so it seems he's mostly been removed from the genre leading up to this. But I gotta say, this is a truly impressive first venture into horror for him, and considering I watched his first two films just prior to this, which are way smaller in scale and have a totally different feel to them, what a difference, and what a major step up. I gotta be honest, I thought I was going to wind up being something of a contrarian with this review, as the first time I saw this movie, I liked it, but definitely not as much as a lot of other people did. I think I was expecting a bit of a different movie, and I was a little thrown off by what we got. And that was the prevailing thought in my head for quite some time, and I'll elaborate on that in a second. I actually hadn't had a chance to rewatch this movie though until I sat down with it again for this review. And now that I know what I was walking into and was a bit more prepared for it, I wound up liking it a lot more, because this is such a great movie. Now, I still don't know if I'd call it one of the best horror movies in the last decade or so, like a lot of other people have. It still needs to sit with me a bit as far as that goes, but it's certainly a really enjoyable experience overall. So, a lot of good horror movies don't just rely on this one terrifying creature or creatures simply attacking for 90 minutes to 2 hours. That's a big part of it, don't get me wrong, but a lot of what makes these forces, and the films as a whole, so terrifying is usually how they're played in relation to the fears of the characters and what they're going through. Not every horror movie is necessarily like that, like I wouldn't call every masterclass in horror the deepest character study, but a lot of the good ones do incorporate solid character building and play off what we know about each of them in relation to the villain at hand. And that's what this does here, and to an extreme, but in a totally good way. While the film was marketed as this sort of creature feature with these mysterious monsters who operate totally based on sound, they're not really the primary force driving the entire movie. It's the family we follow who do. It's their troubles, their fears, their relationships with each other, and I'd call this very much a character drama first, and then a horror movie, which I think is what initially threw me off about watching this. Like I said, there are a lot of great movies that do play upon the main characters' relationships in some way or the other, but here, it's those interactions among our four main characters that are at the forefront. Krasinski referred to the film as a metaphor for parenthood, which played a big part in why he decided to take on the project. He just became a father himself as the film was being developed, and he incorporated a lot of his own anxieties regarding being a good father into the storyline, which leads to the film's infamous opening scene, which hits those themes, being the thing that hangs over all of our characters' heads for the entire movie. Usually in horror films, we almost always get that cold opening where it's sometime prior to the main events, and it's used mainly to serve as an introduction to whatever the villain is, and otherwise is only loosely connected to the rest of the film's events, as it's normally focused on characters unrelated to the main characters. But that's not 100% the case here. While it does serve as an introduction to these unnamed creatures, it also introduces us to our four main characters, known as the Abbots. And we also have a fifth character, who's their youngest son, who dies in the opening scene at the hands of one of the creatures, with Krasinski unable to save him after he turns on a very loud toy spaceship. Now, that's a very gutsy sequence to have as your opening, with the killing of a young child. But it's not done just for the sake of shocking the audience. For one thing, as I said, it does serve as the perfect introduction to these alien-like creatures. Unlike a lot of other horror movies where, if you see the villain coming, there's a little wiggle room to make a run for it, and the characters are just outmatched in the chase, with these creatures, it's like you're dead in an instant. We see the entire family walking in a line along this bridge, only a few feet apart from one another. There are only two other characters separating Krasinski and his son, as one of the other kids was being held, and he makes a run for it almost immediately, as soon as he hears that toy turn on. And while it feels like it's a lot longer because of the masterful editing by Christopher Tellefson, it's really like instantaneous that this creature shows up as soon as the toy's heard. Krasinski wasn't even like centimeters away from his kid when the thing snatches him up. It's horrifying just how quick it is, and it immediately ratchets the tension all the way up for the rest of the movie, as it tells us just how high these stakes are. But as I said, this incident fuels much of the main events. Even though it takes place a year later, and well into this post-apocalyptic way of living, this family's still reeling from this loss. Their daughter Reagan, played by Millicent Simmons, can't get over what happened because she blames herself for it. We see in that opening scene that after the toy was initially taken away, she hands it back to her brother, though just without the batteries, which he takes behind everyone's backs. But she feels his death is her responsibility, especially because she hasn't felt as close with her father since then. Their relationship is very standoffish for much of the film, even if it's not totally intentional. Now, she's definitely the one who's a lot more rebellious towards him, especially in one scene as he tries to give her new cochlear implants he's been working on, and she tells him to knock it off. But what doesn't help either is the way he acts. He rightfully always has this survivalist instinct out in the forefront, but it doesn't always translate so well when he's interacting with his kids. There's a conversation he has with his son Marcus, played by Noah Jupe, under a waterfall where the creatures can't hear them, and Marcus says to him that he should tell Reagan he loves her because she needs to hear it, and you come to realize just how complex and nuanced these characters are. A promise you hear Krasinski's character Lee make in this film is that he'll always protect his kids, and that's always what's on his mind each time he interacts with them. Every little movement is done first and foremost as a protector, as someone who wants not only himself but his loved ones to survive, and that's all he has on his mind, rightfully so. But even in those smaller interactions, there's still that mentality on display. So he's not being mean to his kids or necessarily being emotionally distant, but without him fully realizing it, he doesn't always come off as this caring father, because his fears are what's driving him, though that inadvertently causes tension between him and his kids, Reagan especially. And I thought that that was just masterful storytelling right there, as it gives us a ton of suspense, not just from the creatures themselves, but among the family as a whole, with Emily Blunt's character Evelyn attempting to keep the peace among everyone to a degree. Now, one thing that's remained consistent throughout Krasinski's films is this earnest tone. Even the first two movies, which ultimately did not work for me, I still found there to be a sincerity to them through his directing. Here, it's completely on display, and it clicks so well. Now, a lot of it's mainly due to the chemistry among all the cast. Part of what helps that too is that John Krasinski and Emily Blunt are married in real life, as they are in this film. They've been married for quite some time, so even though this is their first time starring in a film together, they already know how to work off each other so well. Another big reason too is that Millicent Simmons is actually deaf in real life, just like her character Reagan is, along with the fact that all of the actors communicate mostly through sign language, and they were taught how to properly sign prior to shooting. And it really just adds to the authenticity here. And what's great too is that even how they sign to one another still tells us so much about how they're dealing with each situation. For example, Lee signs very quickly, which shows his survivalist instincts, as he needs to be to the point so the family can focus on the task at hand. But on the opposite end of that, Reagan signs in a very defiant manner to reflect the rebellious nature she has towards her father, given how prior events occurred. there's still a lot of emoting through these gestures. And what I appreciated is how a lot of the nuances were brought out even without the characters having to vocally express them. And that's just another thing I appreciated about this film in general. Film's a very visual medium. While there are dialogue-heavy films that do work, those tend to be the exception and not the rule. A really well-made film relies on visual cues, actors' facial expressions, certain camera shots, among many other things to evoke the necessary emotions from the audience, and I thought that was done so well here. Like, characters do technically speak to each other often throughout the film, but it's all through sign language, and the amount of spoken dialogue here, due to the circumstances, is at a bare minimum. Yet we managed to still get a mostly good sense of their characters, both through the sign language and by how they interact with their surroundings and live their lives, even in some subtler moments. Like, these are all very smart characters, who mostly make all the right decisions. But the fact that they almost never slip up is natural here, as we're being introduced to these characters well into this outbreak. And it's meant to show that they've gotten an idea how to handle things. They tend to walk around in their bare feet, they play board games, but they swap out some of the pieces, like we see the kids playing Monopoly in an early scene, but they replace the metal pieces used to move around the board with these softer objects. They also have backup plans in place in case things go wrong, like during the scene when Evelyn's by herself in the house, she flips a switch that lights everything outside up to let the other characters know she's in trouble. So this is a family who's cautious, and we see they are prone to potentially making mistakes, but more often than not, they're one step ahead. And honestly, it's refreshing to see that in a horror film, as we're used to characters slipping up constantly and making all the worst possible decisions you can make. And again, it also makes sense, considering we see how grave of a mistake was made in that opening sequence, and every action they take a year later reflects them learning from that mistake. So I thought that was a nice touch. Now, I also haven't mentioned how terrifying this movie can be. Now, like I said, it is primarily a character-driven movie, but it can be pretty frightening, which is still the main goal of any horror movie. And here, it mostly succeeds in its scares. And that's especially due to the masterful sound mixing. You experience this world the same way these characters experience it. We do have a score by Marco Beltrami that complements some of the action, but some of the most crucial scenes are shown to us in total silence. And if a noise is made, that sound is amplified, like something knocking over, or a character moving the wrong way, or even just the tiniest yelp. So it sounds even louder than it would under normal circumstances, and it immediately puts you on the edge, as now you're fearing these creatures would show up any second. Now, there are times where this is done in service of jump scares, which I think this film really didn't need whatsoever. Like, I found these creatures to be so terrifying, even when they were just on screen and haven't done anything yet, that was enough for me. Like, we got these fake out moments where we think it's them and it's just an animal appearing or one of the characters emerging from hiding, and I thought that wasn't necessary. But there are some sequences that are just masterfully executed chills. The best example being the bathtub sequence, where Evelyn's stuck in the house by herself and she has to give birth on her own, which is already difficult enough, but to complicate things, she has to make sure she doesn't utter a sound while doing so, especially with no one there to closely protect her. Even having already seen the film once, on a second viewing, it still had me on the edge of my seat for the top-notch editing and sound mixing. Now, I'd say this is a pretty nerve-wracking experience overall. Like, it's so emotionally intense between the creatures themselves and the tension among the family, and as I said, that's the driving force behind much of this film. But another minor criticism that really may be more of a personal preference for me is that while this is a film centered heavily on the importance of family, I would have liked had we gotten just a few more quick emotional beats with the family thrown in there. Like, I get that the name of the game is survival, but I think sometimes we're so honed in on that there were just a few stretches, and I mean like a small amount here, where we didn't get to see the characters feel for one another, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think we needed anything that slowed the movie down or take too long of a breath, because I found it to be paced extremely well for the most part. And I get in these sort of movies, they gotta be alert and always aware of their surroundings at all times. And as I mentioned earlier, a big source of tension is that Lee's so focused on surviving that he doesn't always act like a caring father to his kids. So there's always this heightened state that characters are in, even during a seemingly uneventful moment. But there were just a few small stretches of time where it was so honed in on moving on to the next thing that we as an audience don't really get a chance to connect with them in certain moments. Like in some instances where one character is rescuing another, we don't see that look of satisfaction that they made sure their loved one's okay, for example. Like, we didn't need anything that made it feel like we're in a totally different movie or they pretend the monsters aren't there. It could have just been a quick shot of a look they give, and it would have gone a long way. And this wasn't anything that ruined the movie for me or detracted from my experience, don't get me wrong there. Like I said, it's really more of a personal preference, and for some of you, that may not be an issue at all. It's just something I couldn't get out of my head. But what I will say is, at the very least, the wait for one of those moments does pay off in one of the final scenes, where right before Lee gets killed by one of the creatures, he signs to Reagan that he loves her, and he always has, giving her that sense of closure she's wanted ever since her brother died. And that moment hits so well, just because we've been waiting for the two of them to have that really nice moment ever since Marcus said to him early on that he should tell her he loves her. And it's worth noting that Lee and Reagan hadn't seen each other since Marcus said that. So the build up to that particular moment paid off in numbers, and it was one of the most effective scenes in the entire movie. Also, I do love how the film ended with you wanting more, but at the same time still felt satisfying. Like, even though we now know obviously there's a sequel, ending it with the family figuring out how to kill these things, and then that last shot is of Emily Blunt cocking the gun before they enter their house, was perfect. Like, even though you want to see her actually dispose of these creatures and see where the family goes from there, which again we do in the sequel, cutting the movie off where it did was still not a bad choice. Like, it still leaves things on an optimistic enough note that you have a pretty good idea of where it's headed, and you can picture it for yourself. And if the sequel didn't come to fruition, while it would be disappointing, it still leaves you with enough that it makes for an overall satisfying ending. A Quiet Place is nothing short of great. It's such a meticulously crafted, spine-tingling horror movie that knows how to make proper use of the less is more notion. It relies almost exclusively on visual storytelling in this series of heightened situations, using characters' facial expressions, body language, as well as the overall silence and amplified noises to properly bring out the terror of this world. It's a massive step up in terms of quality for Krasinski's directorial efforts, and if all of his future films are going to be anything like this, it seems like we're in for a real treat. A Quiet Place gets an 8.5 out of 10. Like I said, this was a much better experience for me second time around. And I think it was because I was so thrown off that first time, because I was expecting a bit of a different movie. So on first viewing, I was simply like, it was good, and that's it. Like, it probably would have amounted to a 7 or a 7.5 out of 10. And while it was already a satisfying experience, now that I knew what I was in for going into it a second time, it felt so much better. But now that I've reviewed all of Krasinski's other films, stay tuned for my review of A Quiet Place Part 2, followed by a ranking of all 4 of his movies. But in the meantime, let me know, did you see A Quiet Place, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you enjoy this one as much as everyone else did? Are you looking forward to the second movie? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.